The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Tetbury as shopkeepers peered through their windows, wondering if the rumors were true. Would the king really come to their small Gloucestershire town to see what Mrs. Henderson had built in her backyard? Little did they know that this visit would spark a movement that would reach every corner of Britain, proving that sometimes the smallest seeds of change grow in the most unexpected places. The alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 in the morning, but Sarah Henderson was already awake. She had been staring at the ceiling for hours, her mind racing with 1,000 what-ifs. Today wasn't just another Tuesday in Tetbury. Today, King Charles III and Queen Camilla would visit her community garden project, something she had started 3 years ago with nothing but determination and a patch of unused land behind the local community center. Sarah rolled out of bed and padded to her kitchen window. Through the glass, she could see the early morning light casting long shadows across her own small garden. The tomatoes were just beginning to ripen, and the runner beans climbed enthusiastically up their poles. It was this very view that had inspired her crazy idea back in 2021, when the world was emerging from the pandemic and people were desperately seeking connection with both nature and each other. The idea had been simple enough. The community center had a large, neglected plot of land at the back that was used for nothing except storing old furniture and collecting weeds. Sarah had approached the council with a proposal that seemed almost too humble to matter. She wanted to create a space where local families could grow their own vegetables, where children could learn about where food comes from, and where neighbors could meet over shared soil and common purpose. The council members had looked at her proposal with the kind of polite skepticism reserved for well-meaning but impractical ideas. Mrs. Thompson from the Housing Committee had asked about insurance. Mr. Davies had wondered about vandalism. The treasurer had questioned whether anyone would actually use such a space. But Sarah had persisted, armed with research about similar projects in other towns and a quiet confidence that her community needed this more than they realized. The first year had been harder than she had expected. The soil was poor, compacted from years of neglect. The weather had been uncooperative, with a particularly wet spring followed by a drought that lasted most of the summer. Only 7 families had signed up initially, and, by autumn, that number had dwindled to 4. Sarah spent many evenings alone in the garden, pulling weeds and wondering if she had bitten off more than she could chew. But something magical happened that first winter. Word began to spread about the small community that had formed around the garden plots. Mrs. Ahmed, who had moved to Tetbury from Somalia 5 years earlier, began sharing seeds from vegetables she remembered from her homeland. Her plot became a living catalogue of exotic flavors that intrigued the other gardeners. Young Tommy Fletcher, barely 8 years old, became obsessed with growing the biggest pumpkin anyone had ever seen. His enthusiasm was infectious, and soon other children were dragging their parents to the garden to see Tommy's latest measurements and predictions. By the second year, the waiting list had 30 names on it. Sarah had to expand the project, negotiating with the council for additional space and organizing working parties to prepare new plots. The local hardware store began donating tools and materials. The pub started hosting monthly meetings where gardeners shared tips, recipes, and stories. What had started as a simple growing space had evolved into something much more significant, a genuine community hub that brought together people who might never have spoken otherwise. The transformation wasn't just about vegetables. Mrs. Patel, who had been struggling with depression following her husband's death, found purpose and friendship among the raised beds. She became the unofficial expert on companion planting, teaching others how different plants could support each other's growth. Young adults who had returned to live with their parents during the economic uncertainty found a place to contribute and feel productive. Elderly residents discovered that their lifetime of gardening knowledge was valued and sought after by younger generations. Sarah often marveled at the conversations that happened naturally among the garden plots. Political differences seemed to disappear when people were focused on the shared challenge of coaxing life from soil. Cultural barriers dissolved as recipes and growing techniques were exchanged. Children who might otherwise spend their free time indoors with screens instead found themselves fascinated by the slow miracle of seeds becoming food. The garden began attracting attention from neighboring towns. Other community leaders visited to see how such a simple idea had created such profound connections. Sarah found herself invited to speak at conferences about community development and social cohesion. Academic researchers asked to study the garden's impact on local well-being and environmental awareness. It was Dr. Margaret Sinclair from the University of Bath who first suggested that the project might interest the king. Dr. Sinclair had been documenting various community initiatives across the southwest of England, and she had been particularly impressed by how the Tetbury Garden had addressed multiple social and environmental challenges simultaneously. She knew that King Charles had long been an advocate for sustainable agriculture and community-based solutions to social problems. The initial contact had come through proper channels, a letter from Clarence House to the council, expressing the king's interest in visiting local initiatives that demonstrated practical approaches to sustainability and community building. Sarah had assumed it was some kind of mistake. Surely they meant a different project, something larger and more impressive than her small plot of vegetables and volunteer enthusiasm. But the correspondence continued. Representatives from the royal household visited quietly to assess the garden and speak with participants. They asked detailed questions about how the project had started, how it was sustained, and what impact it had made on the local community. Sarah found their genuine interest both flattering and slightly overwhelming. The weeks leading up to the visit had been a whirlwind of preparation. Not the kind of artificial tidying that creates false impressions, but rather an opportunity to showcase the garden at its authentic best. The summer growing season had been particularly successful. The plots were abundant with produce, and the community spirit was visible in every corner of the space. Sarah had insisted that the visit should reflect the garden's real character. There would be no special decorations or artificial enhancements. The king and queen would see the space as the gardeners experienced it every day, practical, productive, and genuinely communal. If they were going to spotlight this local initiative, it should be the real thing, not a performance designed to impress. As Sarah made her morning coffee, she could hear the sounds of early preparation beginning outside. The council had arranged for minimal security measures that wouldn't disrupt the garden's normal function. Local media had been notified, but Sarah had requested that the focus remain on the project and its community impact rather than on royal celebrity. The irony wasn't lost on her that this simple garden, born from her frustration with unused space and disconnected neighbors, was about to receive attention from the highest levels of British society. Yet somehow it felt appropriate. The project had always been about recognizing the potential in overlooked places and forgotten resources. Perhaps the royal visit would help other communities see that extraordinary change could grow from very ordinary beginnings. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Mrs. Ahmed, calling to check whether Sarah thought the morning light would be good for showing the king her heritage vegetable plots. They talked through the planned route and timing, both of them marveling at the surreal nature of the conversation. 3 years ago, they had been strangers. Now they were coordinating a royal visit to their shared passion project. As Sarah prepared to leave for the garden, she reflected on how much had changed since that first tentative proposal to the council. The physical transformation was obvious. What had been wasteland was now productive and beautiful. But the human transformation was even more profound. A community had discovered its own capacity for positive change. Neighbors had become friends. Children had learned that they could nurture life and witness the results of patience and care. Today's visit would bring external recognition to these achievements, but Sarah knew that the real success of the project lay in its daily, unremarkable moments. The quiet satisfaction of harvesting vegetables you had grown yourself. The pleasure of sharing surplus produce with neighbors. The discovery that working together toward common goals created connections that enriched everyone involved. The morning mist was beginning to lift as Sarah walked toward the community center. Other early arrivals were already there, not because they had to be, but because they wanted to be part of whatever happened next. The garden had taught them all that growth was a collective effort, and today's spotlight would shine on something they had built together. The black cars arrived at precisely 10:15, their quiet purr barely audible above the nervous chatter of the small crowd that had gathered at the community center. Sarah Henderson felt her heart hammering as she smoothed down her practical gardening jacket, the same one she wore every day when tending to the plots. She had decided against buying something new and formal, reasoning that authenticity was more important than protocol. King Charles emerged from the first vehicle with the kind of graceful ease that comes from decades of such arrivals. He was dressed casually by royal standards, in a well-worn tweed jacket and sturdy shoes that suggested he was prepared for actual garden walking rather than ceremonial viewing. Queen Camilla followed, her smile warm and immediate as she took in the scene before her. Sarah had expected to feel intimidated, but there was something remarkably approachable about the royal couple as they were introduced to her by the local council representative. The king's first question wasn't about statistics or outcomes, but rather about what had inspired her to start the project. His genuine curiosity put her at ease, and she found herself speaking naturally about the unused land and her vision for community connection. They began their tour at the entrance to the garden, where a simple wooden sign announced the space as the Tetbury Community Growing Project. The sign had been made by local teenagers as part of a woodworking class, and the king paused to examine the craftsmanship, asking detailed questions about the joinery techniques used. This attention to small details and skilled work would characterize the entire visit. Mrs. Ahmed was waiting at her heritage vegetable plot, clearly nervous but determined to share her story. She had laid out samples of the seeds she had brought from Somalia, each one carefully labeled with both English and Somali names. The queen was particularly interested in the medicinal herbs that Mrs. Ahmed grew, listening intently as she explained how different plants were used in traditional remedies. The conversation revealed the depth of knowledge that existed within the community garden. Mrs. Ahmed wasn't just growing food, she was preserving cultural knowledge and sharing it with her neighbors. The king asked whether she had considered documenting these traditional uses, suggesting that such knowledge was invaluable for both cultural preservation and practical application. Young Tommy Fletcher had been bouncing with excitement since dawn, and his enthusiasm was irrepressible when the royal couple reached his plot. His pumpkin plants had indeed produced impressive results, and he launched into an animated explanation of his growing techniques, complete with charts he had made showing growth measurements over time. The queen was delighted by his scientific approach, and the king asked thoughtful questions about soil preparation and pest management. Tommy's mother, watching from nearby, later said that she had never seen her son so confident speaking with adults. The garden had given him expertise that was genuinely valuable, and the royal recognition of that expertise was transformative for his sense of capability and worth. The visit revealed layers of impact that even Sarah hadn't fully recognized. Mr. Williams, a retired engineer who had been struggling with the isolation of retirement, had applied his technical skills to designing an innovative rainwater collection system for the garden. The king examined the system with obvious interest, discussing water conservation principles and asking about the system's efficiency. What became clear during these conversations was that the garden had become a place where people's diverse skills and knowledge were valued and utilized. Retirees weren't just filling time, they were contributing expertise. Young people weren't just helping, they were learning valuable skills. Immigrants weren't just integrating, they were sharing cultural wealth that enriched the entire community. The queen spent considerable time with the children's growing area, where local schools had established classroom plots. 8-year-old Maisie proudly showed off her sunflower experiment, explaining how she had been measuring the effect of different growing conditions on plant height. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, explained how the garden had transformed her science lessons, making abstract concepts concrete and engaging. The educational dimension of the project had evolved organically. Teachers had begun to see the garden as an outdoor classroom where children could learn about biology, chemistry, weather, seasons, and nutrition through direct experience. Math lessons became more meaningful when children were calculating growing space and measuring harvest yields. History lessons came alive when they grew vegetables that their grandparents might have cultivated during wartime. Dr. Sinclair from the University of Bath was present to discuss her research on the garden's broader impacts. She had been documenting improvements in community cohesion, mental health outcomes, and environmental awareness among participants. Her data showed measurable increases in social connections, with garden participants reporting significantly more interactions with neighbors and greater sense of belonging to their community. The king was particularly interested in the project's approach to sustainability. The garden used entirely organic methods, composted all its waste, and had achieved remarkable productivity from relatively small plots. More importantly, it was financially sustainable, operating on minimal external funding and generating enough produce and community support to maintain itself. This sustainability wasn't accidental. Sarah had deliberately designed the project to be replicable and self-sustaining. The initial setup costs were low, the ongoing expenses were minimal, and the benefits were immediately visible to participants. This practical approach had been crucial to the project's success and was exactly the kind of model that could be adapted by other communities. The Queen spoke at length with Mrs. Patel about the garden's impact on mental health and social isolation. Mrs. Patel shared honestly about her difficult period following her husband's death and how the garden had provided both purpose and companionship during her grief. Her story was echoed by several other participants who had found in the garden a form of therapy that no formal program could have provided. The mental health benefits hadn't been an intended outcome of the project, but they had become one of its most significant achievements. The combination of physical activity, connection with nature, social interaction, and sense of purpose created a powerful antidote to the isolation and anxiety that affected many community members. Halfway through the visit, the king asked to see the composting area, which most visitors overlooked in favor of the more photogenic vegetable plots. Sarah was pleased by this request because it demonstrated understanding that the garden was a complete ecosystem, not just a collection of pretty growing spaces. The composting system had been designed by a local environmental science student and was remarkably efficient at converting kitchen waste and garden trimmings into rich soil amendment. This attention to the less glamorous aspects of the project reflected the king's genuine understanding of sustainable agriculture. He asked detailed questions about the carbon-nitrogen balance in the compost, the role of different decomposer organisms, and how the system contributed to the garden's overall productivity. These weren't ceremonial questions, they were the inquiries of someone with deep practical knowledge. The Queen was equally engaged, but her focus was often on the human stories behind the garden's success. She spent time with elderly participants, asking about their gardening memories and how this project compared to their previous experiences. She spoke with parents about how the garden had affected their family routines and their children's eating habits. One particularly moving conversation occurred with 15-year-old Jake, who had initially been assigned community service hours at the garden as part of a youth offending program. What had started as mandatory participation had evolved into genuine passion. Jake had discovered that he had natural talent for growing things and was now considering pursuing horticulture as a career path. Jake's transformation illustrated another unexpected dimension of the project's impact. The garden had become a place of second chances, where people could discover hidden talents and interests. Young people with troubled backgrounds found constructive ways to channel their energy. Adults who felt stuck in unfulfilling routines discovered new sources of satisfaction and identity. The media presence was carefully managed to focus on the project rather than royal celebrity. Local newspaper reporters interviewed participants about their experiences, while photographers captured the genuine interactions between the royal visitors and community members. The resulting coverage would later emphasize the replicability of the project and its practical benefits rather than treating it as a unique achievement. As the visit progressed, it became clear that this wasn't just royal recognition of a successful local initiative. The king and queen were genuinely learning from what they saw, asking questions that suggested they were thinking about how such approaches could be encouraged more broadly. Their engagement was intellectual as well as ceremonial, practical as well as symbolic. The final part of the tour included the workshop area where tools were maintained and seedlings were started. Local volunteers demonstrated various techniques for seed saving, plant propagation, and natural pest control. The king participated in repotting seedlings, his hands showing the confidence of someone familiar with such work. This hands-on participation was perhaps the most significant moment of the visit. It demonstrated that royal recognition didn't create distance between the visitors and the project, but rather acknowledged shared values and interests. The garden represented principles that the king had long advocated: sustainability, community engagement, and practical environmentalism. As the official visit portion concluded, something unexpected happened. Rather than immediately departing, the royal couple lingered, continuing conversations and asking follow-up questions. The scheduled hour had stretched to nearly 2 hours, and their engagement showed no signs of formal politeness wearing thin. The extended time allowed for deeper discussions about challenges the project had faced and overcome. Sarah was able to explain the initial skepticism from some community members, the seasonal difficulties of maintaining enthusiasm, and the ongoing need to balance individual garden plots with communal activities. These challenges resonated with the king's own experiences in promoting environmental and community initiatives. He shared insights about the importance of persistence when introducing new ideas and the value of demonstrating success through example rather than argument. The visit concluded with photographs, but not the formal, posed images typical of royal engagements. Instead, the pictures captured genuine moments of interaction, the king examining soil quality with a young gardener, the queen laughing with children who were showing off their harvest, participants explaining their techniques with obvious pride and knowledge. As the royal cars prepared to leave, the king made an unexpected announcement. He expressed interest in learning more about how the Tetbury model could be adapted for other communities. This wasn't just ceremonial praise, it was a commitment to practical action that would extend the project's influence far beyond its original scope. The weeks following the royal visit brought changes that no one had anticipated. Sarah Henderson's phone began ringing at all hours with inquiries from communities across Britain who had seen the media coverage and wanted to know how they could start similar projects. What had been a local success story was rapidly becoming a national movement. The first call came from a housing association in Manchester. The project coordinator had watched the television coverage and was inspired by how the Tetbury Garden had brought together people from different backgrounds and ages. They had access to unused land behind several apartment blocks but had never considered its potential for community building. Could Sarah help them understand how to begin? Similar inquiries followed from Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Parish councils, community centres, schools, and housing associations all wanted guidance on adapting the Tetbury model to their specific circumstances and populations. Sarah found herself inadvertently becoming a consultant for community development, a role she had never sought but was uniquely qualified to fill. The King's office had taken note of this spontaneous expansion of interest. Within a month of the visit, Clarence House contacted Sarah with a proposal that took her breath away. Would she consider helping to develop a formal framework that could support community garden initiatives across the Commonwealth? The king was prepared to provide funding and institutional support for what he saw as a practical approach to multiple social and environmental challenges. This was far beyond anything Sarah had imagined when she first approached the council about the unused land behind the community center. The simple desire to grow vegetables and meet neighbors had evolved into something that might influence community development policy at the highest levels of government. The Queen had been equally impressed by what she had seen in Tetbury. Her long-standing interest in literacy and education had been sparked by the garden's success in engaging children with learning through practical application. She began discussing with her staff how community gardens might be integrated with existing educational initiatives, particularly in areas where traditional approaches were struggling to achieve results. Back in Tetbury, the garden itself was experiencing the effects of its newfound fame. Visitor numbers increased dramatically as community leaders, academics, and journalists came to see the project that had captured royal attention. Sarah worried initially that this attention might disrupt the garden's essential character as a working space for local people. However, the community proved remarkably adept at managing its celebrity status. Regular gardening activities continued on schedule, but participants also embraced their role as informal ambassadors for community-led development. Mrs. Ahmed began giving regular talks to visiting groups about heritage vegetables and cultural exchange. Tommy Fletcher became an enthusiastic guide for school visits, sharing his scientific approach to pumpkin growing with obvious pride and expertise. The garden's educational role expanded organically. Universities began including it in their community development and environmental studies curricula. Student groups arrived regularly to study the project's methods and outcomes. These academic connections brought new resources and perspectives to the garden while providing students with direct experience of successful grassroots initiatives. Dr. Sinclair's research had attracted international attention, and the Tetbury Garden became the subject of case studies in journals focusing on community psychology, sustainable agriculture, and social policy. The humble vegetable plots were generating academic papers that influenced thinking about community resilience and environmental education far beyond Britain's borders. The most significant development came 6 months after the royal visit, when the king announced the creation of the Community Growing Initiative, a formal program designed to support and replicate successful community garden projects across the Commonwealth. The Tetbury Garden would serve as the model and training center for this expanded effort. Sarah was invited to become the initiative's first director, a position that would involve developing guidelines, training community leaders, and overseeing the establishment of new projects. The role came with significant funding from the Prince's Trust and partnerships with major environmental and social organizations. The decision to accept this position wasn't easy for Sarah. It meant leaving her day job and taking responsibility for something much larger than her original modest ambitions. But the potential impact was impossible to ignore. Communities across Britain and beyond were eager to create their own versions of what had started in Tetbury. With proper support and guidance, hundreds of similar projects could flourish. The first pilot programs were established in 12 communities representing different geographic, economic, and demographic conditions. Each location faced unique challenges: urban areas with limited space, rural communities with sparse populations, neighborhoods dealing with social tensions, schools seeking innovative educational approaches. The pilot results exceeded everyone's expectations. Within 18 months, all 12 locations had established thriving community gardens that were generating measurable improvements in social cohesion, environmental awareness, and local food security. More importantly, each had developed its own character and solutions that reflected the specific needs and resources of its community. In Glasgow, a community garden established in a former industrial area had become a focal point for economic regeneration. Local residents were not only growing food but also starting small businesses selling surplus produce and value-added products like preserves and pickles. The project had attracted additional investment in the neighborhood and was contributing to broader urban renewal efforts. A rural community in Wales had used the garden model to address isolation among elderly residents and lack of activities for young people. Their garden included traditional Welsh vegetables and herbs, preserving local agricultural knowledge while creating intergenerational connections. The project had become so successful that neighboring villages were requesting help to start their own versions. In Northern Ireland, a community garden had been established as a peacebuilding initiative, bringing together residents from different religious and political backgrounds around shared environmental goals. The project had succeeded where formal reconciliation programs had struggled, demonstrating the power of practical cooperation to overcome historical divisions. The Queen's interest in educational applications had led to the development of school-based programs that integrated community gardening with classroom learning across multiple subjects. Children were learning mathematics through garden planning, science through plant biology, geography through understanding growing conditions, and history through heritage varieties and traditional farming methods. These educational programs were proving particularly effective in engaging children who struggled with conventional classroom approaches. Teachers reported improved attendance, increased participation, and better academic outcomes among students involved in garden-based learning activities. The international dimension of the initiative had also begun to develop. Commonwealth countries were adapting the model to their specific climates and cultural contexts. A project in Jamaica was combining community gardening with hurricane resilience planning, growing crops that could withstand extreme weather while building community networks that supported disaster recovery. In Australia, indigenous communities were using the garden framework to revitalize traditional food systems and share cultural knowledge with younger generations. The project had become a tool for cultural preservation as well as community development. A particularly innovative adaptation had emerged in Canada, where northern communities were using greenhouse-based growing systems to extend their food security and create year-round community gathering spaces. The harsh climate that had seemed like an obstacle had been transformed into an opportunity for creative solutions. The success of these various initiatives had attracted attention from international development organizations. The United Nations included the Community Growing Initiative in its best practices database for sustainable development, and several countries were considering formal adoption of similar programs. Sarah found herself traveling constantly, visiting new projects, training community leaders, and speaking at conferences about community-led development. The shy council worker who had once nervously proposed a small garden project was now addressing international audiences about social innovation and environmental sustainability. But she always returned to Tetbury, where the original garden continued to thrive as both a working community space and a training center for the broader initiative. The plots that had started the entire movement still produced abundant vegetables, and the same community members who had supported the original project continued to tend their growing spaces with the same enthusiasm that had impressed the king and queen. Mrs. Ahmed had become the garden's unofficial heritage seed librarian, maintaining collections of traditional varieties from multiple cultures and sharing them with new projects across the network. Tommy Fletcher, now in secondary school, was planning to study horticulture at university, inspired by his early success with pumpkin growing and the recognition he had received for his scientific approach. The garden's impact on individual lives remained as important as its broader influence on policy and practice. Mrs. Patel continued to find purpose and friendship among the growing plots. Jake, the teenager who had discovered his talent through community service, had completed his horticultural training and was now employed as a garden coordinator for the Community Growing Initiative. 3 years after the royal visit, Sarah stood in the same spot where she had nervously waited for the black cars to arrive. The garden around her looked much the same, productive, well-maintained, obviously cared for by the people who used it daily. But the ripple effects of that morning's spotlight had spread far beyond anything she could have imagined. The Community Growing Initiative now supported over 300 active projects across 22 countries. Thousands of families were growing their own food, meeting their neighbors, and discovering their capacity to create positive change in their communities. Children were learning that they could nurture life and contribute to their family's well-being. Elderly people were sharing knowledge and finding purpose. Communities were building resilience against economic uncertainty and environmental challenges. The king's original interest in highlighting local initiatives had achieved something remarkable. By shining a spotlight on one small project, he had illuminated the potential that existed in communities everywhere. The royal recognition hadn't just honored what had already been achieved, it had inspired countless others to discover what they might achieve themselves. The phone on Sarah's desk continued to ring with new inquiries from communities wanting to start their own growing projects. Each call represented another group of people who had seen what was possible and wanted to create something similar in their own neighborhood. The movement that had started with one woman's simple idea about unused land and disconnected neighbors was now helping to strengthen communities across the globe. As Sarah prepared for her next site visit, this time to help establish a community garden in a refugee resettlement area, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this point. The royal spotlight had revealed something that had always been true: ordinary people, given opportunity and support, could create extraordinary positive change in their communities. The Tetbury Garden remained the heart of it all, a reminder that the most impactful initiatives often begin with someone who notices a problem, imagines a solution, and takes the first practical step toward making it real. The vegetables still grew, the neighbors still met over shared tasks, and the simple magic of seeds becoming food continued to teach everyone involved about patience, care, and the possibility of positive transformation.